Are lights and sirens why you got into EMS? Are they an essential life-saving intervention, or should we ban them as, I don't know, dangerous tools of mass destruction? Why are you hearing all this talk nationally about prying your federal siren from your cold, dead fingers? All right, I'm a Texan, I'm a little prone to exaggeration, but is that really what's going on here? Or is there a more nuanced discussion taking place these days? Join us after the break and find out.
What is a lighthouse? It is a tower with a bright light at the top, located at an important or dangerous place. The main purpose of a lighthouse is to serve as a navigational aid and to warn of dangerous areas. Welcome to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, illuminating the darkness of current EMS clinical practice with the bright light of science. Here's your host, Dr. Jeff Jarvis.
This is the first quality improvement effort that's ever been undertaken on a national scale, and we're specifically talking about reducing the use of lights and sirens. We have guests that include the authors of these papers and the leaders of this quality improvement initiative. We have some great interviews with Doug Kupas, Lawrence Brown, Michael Redlenner, and Mike Taigman. Before we get to these interviews, I want to thank Williamson County EMS for producing this episode. This is a lot of work. I had a lot of different videos and a lot of interviews, and I just wasn't able to put them all together and pull this off on my own. Our system EMS director, Mike Knipstein, he understands the importance of this issue, and he was willing to support us getting more information out about it. And my colleague at Wilco, Dan Cohen, he has done an amazing job editing all of these various videos and putting them together into something that I think really helps advance this discussion of EMS safety. My thanks to Wilco EMS and specifically Dan Cohen for their incredible support. So let's start off with the discussion of a 1994 paper on this subject by Dr. Doug Kupas. Dr. Kupas has long been a leader on this issue. In addition to writing this paper that we're about to discuss, he is also the author of a NHTSA-funded white paper on the use of lights and sirens, and he is also the lead author of the recent position statement on using lights and sirens, or as he said, lights and siren. He's an EMS and emergency physician in Pennsylvania. He's a professor of emergency medicine at Temple University. He is also the state medical director, the Commonwealth Medical Director of Pennsylvania, and the medical director for the Geisinger EMS system in Danville. He is a board member of the National Association of EMS Physicians, and he is the medical director for the National Association of EMTs.
Well, Dr. Jarvis, it is great to be able to join you to talk about lights and siren, and it's hard to believe that was 1994, almost 30 years ago. The research to that was done essentially 30 years ago. In some ways, we have seen little improvements in the safe use of lights and siren over that 30 years, but I'm really pleased by how much attention this topic is getting now. It's on multiple fronts. There are several big things going on right now that have brought this to the forefront, and it really, I think, is set up to have more of an impact than many other things that have had little impacts over that 30 years, but haven't really dramatically changed the lights and siren use. I think we're set up for that right now. As many emergency medicine residents, when I was in residency in the early 1990s, there was a requirement to do scholarly activity. And the idea was that essentially means you did research, and the expectation was that you also got that research published. What led to my first publication was this residency requirement to do research, and I picked lights and siren. I had a background of being an EMT and paramedic through high school and college, And I also had a background with working with two very different EMS agencies. One was doing essentially what everybody did at the time back then. You got a 911 call, you went to all of them with lights and siren. You picked your patient up and you took them all to the hospital with lights and siren. And I can remember as a 16-year-old EMT questioning some more senior EMTs about whether, some of those patients that we transported really needed a lights and siren transport. One in particular that sticks in mind was a direct admission when we got to the hospital. The other agency that I worked with already was having EMTs screen every call at dispatch, and they were going to only about 70% of their calls with lights and siren. And at the time I was doing that, this is now almost 40 years ago, they were transporting very few to the hospital with lights and sirens. So this concept and the safety of it and the concerns for risk were in my mind at that time. And I decided to work with one of those agencies, and we used a medical protocol to essentially try to limit lights and siren transport. And the medical protocol, I would not suggest that anybody goes to that 1994 article and pull that protocol and say, this is going to be our transport with lights and siren protocol. 30 years ago, things were very different. I would not write the same things. Many of the things in that protocol right now, today, I would say, no, you don't need lights and siren for that. It really did limit it down to 8% of the transports. So the agency that we did this was sort of a suburban agency, suburban and rural at the outskirts, covered an entire county in western Pennsylvania outside of Pittsburgh. We followed over a couple months 1,625 911 calls with transport to the hospital. And the crews documented whether they transported with or without lights and siren. They also, at the time, on the not NEMSQA, because NEMSQA didn't exist then, but the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration had about 104, 109 data points that were being collected by agencies. They had a set of data points that were collected related to how the patient did during your care. Did they worsen? Did they stay the same? Did they improve, or did they die? To further ensure that the EMS clinicians didn't think that the patient worsened, but maybe they got to the hospital and the emergency physician thought, oh, they missed the boat here and this patient was really critical. We actually had a form that was completed by the receiving emergency physician, and that was linked up with the patient care reports and the documentation from the providers, and the selection of which criteria they used on the protocol. So when all was said and done, they transported, out of 1,625 patients in the study, they transported 130 with lights and siren. Patients that were transported without lights and siren, we looked very carefully for any evidence of worsened condition. Did they die on arriving at the emergency department? Did the emergency physician feel that they were critical and should have been brought in as quicker? Keep in mind that at the time we did this, we didn't even know, the literature hadn't been done that shows how much time is saved with lights and siren. But it was this subjective, should they have gotten there quicker? Did they have a critical issue going on? And so we looked at that. There was a dramatic difference in the patients that died and that worsened. Almost all of those were in the category side of transport with lights and siren. The vast majority of the ones that were transported without lights and siren either improved or had no change in their status. But if they did worsen, none of them died, but if they did worsen, when we followed it up on the emergency physician side, they weren't felt to have been had something critical that they should have gotten to the ED faster. I guess the other thing that I will point out is that when you look at the criteria, most of those criteria were almost like the first part of our, trauma triage criteria that people are used to. They were physiologic and anatomic. So they were pointing out things like hypotension or an altered Glasgow coma score. There was one final potential catch-all or relief valve if somebody looked sick and they didn't meet any of the other criteria. And that final one was for EMS clinician judgment. And that one was used in a fair number of the responses. I would say that these days, agencies that have a good culture about the risks and benefits and how often they use lights and siren during transport probably have clinicians that would have looked at some of the patients that back then were viewed to be, oh, maybe they're unstable and I should use lights and siren. Now we do a lot more for our patients. We offer a lot more to our patients. The study I did in '94 was before CPAP and before the advent of like AEDs, and also there's so much has changed. And EMTs are now doing largely many of the things that the paramedics were doing back then. So care has changed dramatically, and I think that the 8% could be viewed as high by some agencies' standards these days. For that time, it was pretty amazing to do 8% lights and siren transport and 92% transport without lights and siren.
So I love this study. I think it, especially taken in the context of the time and the way we were transporting people and responding, I think it was really important work. There are a couple of things just to make sure I understand it. You implemented a protocol that says these are the times and the only times you should go lights and sirens. Some physiologic, some anatomic criteria, and clinician gestalt. You think you need it. And what you found is with that protocol, only 8% of the time did patients go lights and sirens. And then the thing I love is you had a balancing measure here to look at of those patients that went without lights and sirens, did the emergency physician think anything that was missed that would have benefited from lights and sirens? And they did not. It was safe to do this. Is that a safe summation there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that summarizes it very nicely.
One thing, you have a table in here listing the patients that the medic felt decompensated or got worse during transport. And again, in the 30-year-old retrospectoscope, things that I think most medics now would feel very comfortable with. A 63-year-old who had a seizure that was adequately treated with benzos, a 56-year-old who had a little bit of hematemesis after coughing remained stable. I think most of us would look at that and go, of course, I'm not going to go light and siren. So this is outstanding work. Thank you so much for this. And thank you again for the work you're doing. And as a matter of fact, you're doing so much. We're going to come back to you later in this episode and talk about a position statement that you authored. Dr. Kupas, thank you, sir.
Sounds good. You're welcome.
Next, let's take a look at the risk of collision when using lights and sirens. Dr. Lawrence Brown is going to talk to us. He is the Director of Research Education for the Emergency Medicine Residency at the University of Texas Dell Medical School down here in Austin. He's a professor in the Department of Surgery there, and he has been involved in EMS research for over 20 years. He is a wonderful mentor to many EMS researchers, including me, and he was the senior author on our paper on the clinical yield of red lights and sirens. In case you're wondering what a senior author on a paper does, well, they're the ones who make sure the lead author doesn't do or write something stupid. And for that, I am eternally grateful. Dr. Brown, thank you so much for joining us. I know that, like many of us on this podcast, you have a passion for making EMS responses in transport safer. And this issue of the dangers of red lights and sirens and using them wisely is something that you've been working on for quite some time. Can you tell us when you first got interested in this and what was it that really drew your attention?
Yeah, so it was real life, which is the best instigator of all good researcher. I had a couple of friends who were injured in separate ambulance crashes. In both of those cases, driving faster than they should have been for the conditions contributed to those crashes.
So, Dr. Brown, we're talking here about something that for most people is going to be an abstract concept because, again, thankfully, it's rare. But we're talking about crashes. And even though you didn't look at it in this study, you mentioned offline that there is something you really want to focus in on about these crashes. And it's not just about the dents. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so when we talk about lights and sirens use, uh, I don't care about noise. I don't care about how it affects other drivers as long as it doesn't cause them to crash. I don't care if you put a dent in the ambulance. What I care about is when we crash, we hurt ourselves, we hurt our patients. And sometimes maybe that's just a delay. Sometimes maybe it's just some minor injury. But if you crash a big ambulance at speed, the likelihood is somebody's going to be hurt and probably hurt badly.
Great point. Great point. Most of us, when we get hurt in this profession, this is how we get hurt. We sprain our ankles stepping out of the ambulance, which seems to be more common the older we get. We hurt our backs, and then the way we really get hurt is in these crashes. And now we know that they are definitely more common with lights and sirens. Great
Absolutely.
point. The paper that I want to talk to you about is the one that you did with Brooke Watanabe when she was an emergency medicine resident. Obviously, we worked together on looking at the clinical yield of red lights and siren responses. Can you give us a brief overview of some of the other work that you've done on this topic?
Yeah, so the first study that I was involved in was in a little town called Greenville, North Carolina, where we
I might have heard of that.
we looked at, it was actually transport times, and we found about a 45-second difference in transport times when lights and sirens were used versus not used over the same routes, the same time of day, same lighting conditions. Now, Greenville's a pretty small town. We replicated that study in Syracuse, New York. In Syracuse, we actually looked at response times. Syracuse is a bigger city, but we still found it was roughly, I don't remember the exact number, but I want to say about a minute difference in response time and transport times. There's also been plenty of studies by people, not me, that have looked at not only the time differences, but also that injury rates are higher when lights and sirens are used in an ambulance is in a crash. Most fatal ambulance crashes involve lights and sirens. Even though the data are somewhat mixed, there's at least some evidence that ambulances are more likely to crash when they're using lights and sirens.
Absolutely. So we were talking earlier about the one point that you would have for the public, because the public frequently is concerned. Their perception is red lights and sirens are going to get you there much faster, are safe, and what they care about is getting an ambulance there quicker. And you correctly pointed out that if you are involved in a crash on the way to the scene, that is not getting you there quicker. That's actually a delay. And up until a few years ago, we really did not have a way to quantify that. So you and Dr. Watanabe worked on exactly that. Can you tell us about that paper?
Sure. One of the things that we recognized is that the data that we had really predated some of the modern technologies that might impact both lights and sirens use and the safety of ambulance response and transport. So, for example, simple things like dispatchers prioritizing calls based on the information they get. That's not relatively new to current day paramedics, but to old people like me, that's actually a new innovation. Things like real-time traffic mapping, where you can see on your phone or on a computer screen where traffic is backed up and where it's not, and maybe the best route to where you're going. That didn't exist when these prior studies were done. Traffic signal preemption technology didn't exist. So we thought, maybe the state of play has changed. Let's do an analysis looking at current day lights and sirens use and whether or not that's still associated with an increased risk of crashing. So that's how we started on this road.
It's very interesting that you mentioned technology has changed. So those are some obvious ways. I just this morning got a text from Dr. Abraham there in Austin, and it seems that they've been playing with a new toy, and it is a single person mono seat drone that just helicopters people to a scene. Now it's not ready for prime time, but as I looked at it, my smart ass question was, well, where are you going to put the lights and sirens on it? The birds have to get out of the way. But if you think about that, if that is the way you're responding, you don't have to use lights and sirens at all. I was doing a literature search on automated warning systems, and what I was looking for is lights and sirens. That literature is back in the 70s. What I found in current literature was talking about mesh networks where the cars communicate to each other. And as the ambulance is coming in, the network just has the car move out of the way automatically. Completely different concept than anything I've ever been associated with. So maybe this is a time limited problem, but I still see a lot of 1970s Chevys out there. So probably ought to do something in the meantime, huh?
Yeah, I think it'll be a little while before we move to completely autonomous ambulances and emergency
I think
medical
so.
transport.
Well, what did y'all find in this study? Tell me about the methods and what you found.
Yeah, so we used the National EMS Information System database for 2016, which was the most current year of data at the time that we did this study. And we looked specifically at 911 scene responses and subsequent transports strictly by ground EMS vehicles. We excluded interfacility transport, supervisor intercepts, mutual aid responses, things like that. We didn't include those. And we categorize lights and sirens use. The way it's recorded in NEMSQA is either full lights and sirens use throughout either the response phase or transport phase, or there's a notation there for if a call started out as not lights and sirens, but then increased or started out with lights and sirens and then scaled back. So we were able to control for that as well. There's also a variable in the NEMSQA data set that is for a crash-related delay. So it's in the ambulance delay data for a delay that's caused by an ambulance crash. Here's what we found. So out of about 21 million responses in the data set, the crash rate was for responses about 5.5 crashes for every 100,000 ambulance responses. Now you can't have half a crash, so let's call that 11 crashes for every 200,000 ambulance responses. But the difference between if the ambulance was responding with lights and sirens versus not with lights and sirens was about 4.5 versus 5.5. So one extra crash per 100,000 responses. Doesn't sound big, but that's about a 20% increase in crash rate if you're responding with lights and sirens. Now, here's the scary part. In the 14.5 million transports with lights and sirens, the overall crash rate was a little more than 9 crashes per 100,000 transports, almost twice as high as in the response phase. And the difference between lights and sirens and not lights and sirens was huge. So without lights and sirens, there were about 7 crashes per 100,000 transports. With lights and sirens, it was 17 crashes per 100,000 transports. So that's like 2.5 to 3 times greater risk of crashing if you're transporting using lights and sirens. So,
wow. So you talked about the fold increase. So that's your odds ratio. Just because this is a podcast known for being nerdy, in your model, you mentioned weather conditions and unit and size. What were the other things that you controlled for?
Yeah, we didn't have weather. What we had was, so was it a big agency, a busy agency or not? So we had agency volume. Okay. We had the level of care, so paramedic, intermediate, or basic. We had the type of agency, fire-based, community-based, hospital-based. We had how much the agency uses lights and sirens baseline. Are they we use lights and sirens all the time agency, or a half the time agency, or a quarter of the time agency? And we had whether they were full-time paid career agencies, whether they were volunteer or some mix of that. We also knew whether the scene was in an urban area or a suburban area or a rural area. And so we put all of that into the models. And then we also did some, well, what if things. So what if we take out the very small agencies? Does that make a difference? What if we take out the very large agencies? Does that make a difference? What if we look at daytime versus nighttime versus overnight? Does that make a difference? And the thing is, I will say with the response crash data, there was a little bit of variability in there. But for the transport crash data, it was consistent across the board, no matter how you slice it. Stand on your left foot with your right eye closed, it still looks the same.
So none of your sensitivity analyses changed it for the transport.
For the transport, that's correct.
So I'm kind of curious here. You mentioned that one of the factors that you controlled for was the proportion of time that agency responded to lights and sirens. How did you get that?
Oh, we just got it from the data. So,
You just grouped by agency and then, okay, that's clever. I like that.
Yeah, so we put them into 5 groups from the lowest lights and sirens group to the highest lights and siren use group, and we just put them in fifths.
You like that methodology?
I've used it before.
I think that I seem to remember sending you a first draft of our clinical yield, and you suggested doing something similar. So with a sensitivity analysis. So great idea. So let me see if I understand this. When you looked at the NEMSQA data set, you saw 21 million responses to the scene. 14 million of those were with lights and sirens. And when you looked at the odds ratio for a crash with versus without, you saw an odds ratio adjusted for the things of 1.5, meaning a 50% increase in the odds of a collision.
Correct.
For transports going to the hospital, there were 14 million of those, with 3 million of them being with lights and sirens. The odds of being in a crash were 184% higher using red lights and sirens versus without, meaning an adjusted odds ratio of 2.84. Did I get that right?
That's correct.
That's, I think, pretty important. When we look at something that is intrinsically rare, thank God, whether it is collisions or, say, getting a virus, you use incidence numbers. So you're talking about a certain number per 100,000. And I think that makes, it's the natural way to do things, but I don't know that humans are designed to think that way. I really like that odds ratio because I think that helps really get across. We are talking about an increased danger, and that danger is higher with transports.
Absolutely. And you've identified a key issue here that's worth discussing, which is all of us learn and develop our frame of reference based on what we experience. But because the risk of crashing is so small, most of us and most of our agencies won't experience them. And so at a rate of 5 crashes per 100,000 responses, or even 9 crashes per 100,000 transports, most systems aren't going to see a crash every year, or maybe even every 2 or 3 years. And so it would be impossible to get a good understanding of whether lights and sirens had anything to do with that crash at all. And it's only by aggregating these data across millions of ambulance responses that we're actually able to measure and understand the risk.
I think that is a really important point, particularly when you are talking with folks relatively new in their career. Rare events, when multiplied by an awful lot of occurrences, are going to happen.
Yeah.
So I have been in this field for 30 years, granted, not going lights and sirens to calls for all of them, but I've been in collisions, both going to the scene and going to the hospital. And I think it's interesting because as we talk to several of the guests on this podcast, let's face it, none of us are spring chickens, and all of us had been involved with this. So this has touched all of us. So I think that's a great point about rare things and how we perceive them. Perfect point. We saw that there was an increased risk with transport versus responses. Do you have any thoughts about what might be causing that?
Yeah, so that was something that we tried to think about. We don't have data to actually test this, but one of the things we think is typically during the response phase, there are two people in the cab of the ambulance. That means they're sharing the cognitive load of everything that's going on, including looking out for dangers and navigating either over distance or just what's in front of you. In the transport phase, that's typically not true. The other thing is, you pointed out that the rate of lights and sirens use in the transport phase was actually quite low. So we know that providers are already doing some decision making about this. But that also probably means that when lights and sirens are used during transport, it's a higher stress, higher concern encounter, and that might translate into somewhat more aggressive driving that then results in crashes. So
Yeah.
we can't prove that, but we think that makes sense.
I think that's a pretty reasonable explanation for this. So, what is your takeaway about this paper?
My takeaway about this paper is that driving with lights and sirens increases the risk of an ambulance being in a crash. My takeaway for EMS people in general is using lights and sirens really doesn't save much time at all. The clinical circumstances in which that could be beneficial are quite few. And because we now know that it's also associated with an increased risk of crashing, just think about all of those things and make an informed decision about lights and sirens use that's based on what a patient needs and the safety of the circumstances.
Absolutely. I think that's a perfect summation. Just like we would not intubate every patient just because we can, we only want to do it when it's appropriate. Same thing. Don't use the lights and sirens just because you can. Use them because you think that small chance they will be useful is worth it for this situation. Great, great takeaway point. Well, Dr. Brown, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for having me.
Now that we know some of the evidence about the association between lights and sirens use and the increased risk of collision, let's go back to Dr. Kupas and find out how much time is actually saved using lights and sirens. We're going to talk to him about the white paper that he did for NHTSA, and this white paper is a wonderful summation of the literature to date on the subject when he wrote it. Dr. Kupas. Well, Dr. Kupas, welcome back. You know, we mentioned that you have done a lot of work in this space. One of the things that you did that is incredibly helpful to anyone who wants to very rapidly get a great idea of the prior scientific work that has been done on this topic of light and siren use. You were the author on a white paper that was done for NHTSA. This was published in 2017. Amazing work, over 200 references, really does a great job of summarizing up the literature on this. Based on that work, I got a couple questions for you. You ready for this?
Yeah, fire away.
All right. We know that the only conceivable benefit of lights and siren use is that it saves time. How much time does it save?
As part of writing that 2017 monograph, I really searched the world's literature to find everything that I could that looked at how much time was saved. On the response time, we broke it into how much time is saved on response and how much time is saved on transport. And interestingly, these publications and research on this were all done slightly differently in a number of different systems, a number of different urban settings, traffic congestion, rural settings, suburban settings. Despite them all having slightly different ways of doing it, they all came to somewhat close findings. And on the response side, there were 7 articles, and the 7 articles showed average savings of anywhere from the article that showed the least amount of save time was 1.7 minutes, and the most amount of save time was 3.6 minutes. So out of 7 articles and different research methodologies, I think it's pretty safe to say that, in most communities, you're going to save a few minutes with lights and siren response, but it could be as little as an average of 1.7 and as much as 3.6. And many of these actually found some of their responses were faster without the lights and siren, but these are numbers that are on average. When we look at the transport side, there were 8 articles that looked at the transport, and again, done in different ways of collecting their data, but they showed everything from Dr. Rick Hunt's work that showed a 42 seconds saved in transport with lights and siren in Greenville, North Carolina, moderate-sized city, to 3.8 minutes saved. So again, similar range of, both of them showing about a minute on the low end and about 3.5 to 4 minutes on the high end. It's probably safe to say that in most situations, you're going to save 2 or 3 minutes with lights and siren, whether it's with transport or with response.
So we're saving, just to round everything up, between 1 and 4 minutes. What is the harm of that? I mean, hey, that's great. We're saving this. Time is clearly life's saved, and we're hitting that in a different session here. What is the potential risk? What's the real harm in doing this?
Well, you're obviously setting me up with the time is life saved because, first of all, I want people to understand when you start talking about lights and siren, people sometimes get vitriol and the tweets that go out we are not suggesting that in EMS we should be going to all of our cardiac arrests, unresponsive people, potential cardiac arrests without lights and siren use. There are situations in medicine where, that 2 minutes saved could make a significant change in outcome. But those are few and far between out of most of our responses. So aside from setting me up with that there, Dr. Jarvis, are there risks to using it? I mean, why don't we just say, well, what's the harm? We'll save a few minutes and let's just use it all the time. Well, there are very distinct risks. There are risks of crashes, and we know that there are thousands of EMS vehicle crashes every year. You can Google at almost any time and find fatal EMS crashes within the last week or so of any given time that you look for them. Many of those are related to lights and siren. Some are not related to lights and siren, but many are related. We know that if you're in an ambulance crash, that you have a higher rate of being injured than if you're in a crash with a similar sized vehicle. We know that most of the serious injuries occur in unrestrained people. And we have, that's where we have to do a lot of work in getting people in properly restrained in belts and forward-facing seats in our vehicles, et cetera. But, I think if you think about the fact that every ambulance crash has many, many effects, one of which is it's devastating for the EMS agency. Just a simple ambulance crash immediately takes 3 ambulances into service. The one that crashed is taken out of service. You have to send a backup unit to the original call, or if you're transporting the patient, you have to send a backup unit to transport that. And then you have to send at least one, if not a few, and maybe some helicopters in some cases, to take care of all of the other severely injured EMS practitioners, members of the general public that were injured in the crash too. There are also what's called wake effect crashes that don't involve the ambulance, but we go through the intersection against the traffic light. Traffic that's paying attention stops for us, but they have a green light, and then behind them, they're rear-ended. And some have even estimated that could be 4 times as many crashes as the ones that actually involve the ambulance. But those often are less severe, but they cause some significant damage and things too. And then, the other 2 categories here are that there are effects on your patient. When we turn on a siren in the ambulance, the driver's heart rate and blood pressure goes up. The patient has effects. If you're having a heart attack, we used to give everybody having a heart attack beta blockers if the siren is going, and that's essentially like giving your patient adrenaline. The other thing is, it has been well established that EMS practitioners, as well as firefighters in urban settings where they're exposed to lots of siren use, have clear reduction in hearing acuity. And many of them have hearing loss that's earlier than it should be in life. Many of them have off-balance injuries or other injuries in the back of the vehicle as you're trying to do CPR while somebody's going, driving lights and siren, and you get an off-balance injury. So there are many, many risks. And, the risks sometimes are worth the benefits, but we really have to be very careful in choosing when is that risk worth the potential benefit to the patient.
Perfect. I think you have summed that up really well. And I want you to know that I was able to suppress my innate desire to ask you to repeat yourself because I can't hear very well from all the siren use. Great job there. I really do recommend everybody go take a look at this. There is a plethora of citations in there. Great summation. This really is a great place to start your safety journey on this. Dr. Kupas, thank you very much.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Jarvis.
So, what we have learned so far is that we can safely reduce the use of lights and sirens by protocol, that there are more collisions using lights and sirens, and that lights and sirens don't work as well as we think they do, and they certainly don't save as much time as we might expect. Well, let's take a look at what the clinical yield of lights and siren use is. I'm going to share information about a paper that I wrote with Dr. Brown, with Mike Taigman, and one of my paramedic colleagues, Vaughn Hamilton, from Marble Falls Area EMS. Thank you for that kind introduction, Dr. Jarvis. I didn't know how else to start the video with me doing the introduction. Guys, I want to talk to you about a paper that I did with my colleagues Vaughn Hamilton, Mike Taigman, and Dr. Lawrence Brown. We wanted to answer a question that had not yet been answered. That is, what is the clinical yield of using red lights and sirens to respond to a 911 call? We have heard from other guests on this podcast about some things that we know. The other literature that has been done on this tells us that the use of red lights and siren increases the risk of collisions. It increases the risk of delays when you have those collisions. And when you have the collisions, it increases the risk of injuries and even death. This is not good. We have also seen some evidence that at best, we're saving about 4 minutes responding both to the hospital and to the scene. We have also seen some evidence in papers going to the hospital that life-saving interventions were not done in the amount of time that red lights and siren saved. Not very useful. The big question that was still unanswered was how often do we do life-saving interventions in the field when we respond to the scene using red light and siren? That exactly was the question that Vaughn Hamilton asked me when I was out talking to my colleagues there at Marble Falls Area EMS. And it turns out we had the opportunity to do a study and propose a methodology to answer that very question. So we used the 2018 ESO research dataset to answer this question. This dataset is composed of agencies that have allowed us to use their data, anonymized, of course, to answer research questions. We took all 911 calls and we limited that dataset down to just those that had a call nature and patient contact. We then identified every intervention that was listed for those calls, and we broke those down into potentially life-saving or not. Now, we determined whether any given intervention was life-saving or not by a consensus process where each one of the authors looked at the intervention and said, is it life-saving according to a standard definition? The definition we used was any intervention which might, according to standard clinical guidelines, be considered necessary to reverse a critical condition or rapidly improve hemodynamic instability. So that was the definition. We reached a consensus on all of the interventions in the data set. They either were or were not potentially life-saving. And then we calculated the proportion of red light and siren responses that had a potentially life-saving intervention. And then we subset that against the call nature. All right, so what did we find? Of the 7.5 million 911 responses, we ended up with an analysis data set of 3.8 million calls. Massive data set. Of those people included, the vast majority of the agencies were ALS, they were urban, and they were paid. We found that 86% of 911 responses were run with lights and siren. It's a little disconcerting. It's a little something to work on, let's put it that way. We did find, however, that we do better on transports. Only 13% of transports were done with lights and siren. Now, our big question is, what proportion of RLS responses to the scene did we do something life-saving? And the answer was less than 7%. So less than 7% of the time that we scream across our community with lights and siren do we do anything that is potentially life-saving. And the thing I should clarify here is it's not just life-saving in the 3 to 4 minutes that we might potentially save with red lights and sirens. No, it is 7% of interventions done at any time were potentially life-saving. Let me give you an example of some of the interventions that we considered potentially life-saving. So obviously we're going to include any of the things associated with cardiac arrest. That's CPR, mechanical compression devices, airway management, any of the drugs associated with cardiac arrest. We also included things like naloxone and benzodiazepines. Now, benzodiazepines, we recognize that we use benzos a lot of time for non-life-threatening emergencies, like, say, anxiety. But there is also the potential that we could use them for life-saving interventions for things like status epilepticus. So we included them. Very, very conservative definition. Now, if you look at the call natures that we used a lot of life-saving interventions on, I don't think it's surprising to anyone that cardiac arrest and respiratory arrest and gunshot wounds and overdoses were at the top of the list of things that we did life-saving interventions on. What is interesting is at the bottom of the list were things like animal bites and fever and abdominal pain and nausea and vomiting and lift assist. Okay, so maybe those aren't all that surprising. But the benefit of this research is that we said you can identify, based on the call nature, how likely you are to do life-saving stuff with historical data. So because we have said that lights and siren responses are a clinical intervention, just like any other clinical intervention, and should be targeted to only those situations where the potential benefits outweigh the potential risk, we have provided a methodology that we can use to do this safely. Now, I don't want you to think that the list we came up with is the list you should use, or the call natures that we came up with are the call natures you should use. You should use your own data. This is just a methodology to use. Now, using this data set, if we set a threshold for lights and sirens use that said we're only going to respond lights and sirens to those calls that have historically resulted in life-saving interventions at least 5% of the time, we would have seen a 47% reduction in the use of lights and siren. If, on the other hand, we set that threshold at 10%, we would have seen a 62% reduction in the use of lights and siren. What is the right threshold to use? I have no idea. And even if I knew, it would only be good for what's good for my community, not good for your community. I think that's something that needs to be done in each one of your communities. The bottom line, this is a methodology you can use to objectively, using your own historical data, better target this intervention, red light and siren, to the need. I hope this is helpful. Thank you very much. So we now know that using lights and sirens responding to the scene saves between 3 and 4 minutes, and it only results in clinical significant interventions at any point during EMS care, much less the 3 to 4 minutes we save, in less than 7% of patients. It's not a very high yield. Well, let's go back to Dr. Kupas and learn more about the position statement that he recently wrote with a bunch of other great folks that was signed off on by 14 different EMS organizations across the United States and Canada. And this is something really unique. It was signed off on by the National Association of EMTs, by the IAFF and IAFC, by physician organizations, NEMSQA, ACEP, even our friends in Canada. Truly amazing thing when that many organizations in EMS can get together and agree on anything. Let's hear about the details from Dr. Kupas. Dr. Kupas, you are killing it on this podcast. Thank you so much for all of your help. Let's wrap up talking about a really important position statement that just came out. You were the primary author, and boy, talk about a who's who of people involved in EMS, a great list of co-authors. Why don't you tell us about this position statement on the use of light and siren?
Well, thank you very much there, Dr. Jarvis. I think that, this is a topic that has been a lifelong passion for me. The momentum behind this position statement is amazing. So this statement was put together and done by 14 agencies. It replaced a 1994 statement that was done by the National Association of EMS Physicians, one organization. These 14 associations include associations related to EMS, emergency medicine, quality, safety, and fire. And to get 14 organizations with that broad a focus, all agreeing on one thing, was pretty astounding. And I was very happy to be part of that with people from all of those other organizations. If you want to get a high-level summary of what that statement says, first of all, it says EMS, the purpose of EMS is to provide the highest quality healthcare and patient care to people that have emergencies or need healthcare in the out-of-hospital setting. And sometimes it is important to save a few minutes in getting to them because there's an emergency and it's justified to try to get there as quickly as you can. But it also says that, many times when the public calls us, it is not an emergency. As a matter of fact, we know that the vast majority of the calls are not for emergencies. We're doing more and more treat in place, more and more, many of them are refusals of treatment and don't even get transported, that sort of thing. And then many of the ones that do get transported certainly don't need minutes saved to make their outcome better. What are important if you're going to get to that point, though? You need data. Your system needs to closely track this as a quality parameter for what you do. And this is, lights and siren transport and lights and siren response rates are part of the NEMSQA, the National EMS Quality Alliance, which is one of the organizations that were in this. Those are two of their quality points that we should be tracking in every EMS agency. The other thing is that you need to have good emergency medical dispatch protocols. You need to have dispatch centers that understand the importance of this, that do call taking in a way that allows prioritization of calls. Some of that is use of specific EMD protocols, but then on top of that, you need a layer of prioritization of calls and matching the outcomes of those patients with those categories of calls with the response you expect in your community. You need medical direction and quality improvement from other EMS professionals within the agency to look at the data and make those determinations as to where that cut point should be and which calls justify lights and siren use and which ones don't, and other parts of the agency's lights and siren policies. And then you need the public to understand what is going on. We have a lot of misconceptions in EMS. We have the same misconceptions, I think, about what the public expects with lights and siren use. So we need to make sure that we're surveying the public, that we are working with members of our public, working with elected officials, so that they understand these changes that they're seeing if they're seeing less and less responses or transports with lights and siren. In many cases, they prefer that. And we all know that 911 centers get a lot of calls where the caller says, don't come with lights and siren. And then the other group, in addition to the public, which is sort of an extension of them, is the municipal governments. Municipal governments set things like contracts for EMS care within their municipality. And they need to understand the risks. They need to understand that when they set a contract that expects fast response time, they might actually be doing a disservice to people. They might be causing it to be unsafe. They might be causing their communities to be loud and noisy. They might be causing their EMS agencies to be racing to every call fast, but then not be able to prioritize and get to the cardiac arrest or the higher priority calls as quickly because they're racing to everything quickly. They're not prioritizing which ones are more important. And that's sort of, all of the nutshell of all the things that are in that position statement.
First off, thank you for that great summary. The position statement is so good. It really does hit on all of the things. Nice summary of time saved, of harm, of potential benefits. It says, yes, we're not trying to pry this out of your fingers. There is a use for it, but it's a medical intervention and it needs to be targeted. Like any medical intervention, we need to stop making policies at a policy level that encourages us to do things that are unsafe, much like the reason Domino's Pizza no longer has a get it in 10 minutes or it's free. That encouraged bad behavior. They recognize that. And it also talks about the involvement of so many agencies and the public. Great work here. Again, we'll put the link into our show notes. This is a wonderful thing. It's open access. Please take a look.
And I will tell you that one of the things that I think is a lot of people get this. A lot of people are open-minded. They see the overwhelming amount of studies and things that have been done over the last 30 years, all leaning in one direction, and they get it. But culture is tricky. Atul Gawande said something that I quote a lot now, and basically he says, culture is embedded. It is there to stay. It's deep. He said, culture strangles innovation in the crib. And, there are certainly reflexive, nope, this is the way we always did it. This is why we're in EMS. We have to get everywhere. The things that I've heard, on the flip side are often statements like, if it's your family member, or you try holding your breath for 42 seconds to 3.8 minutes, the point is we have good ways of, with a lot of validity, identifying which calls need that savings of a couple minutes and which ones absolutely do not need the savings of a couple minutes, and we're putting people at risk. And I think changing that culture is tricky, but EMS providers that work in systems where they respond to a quarter of their 911 calls with lights and siren and the other 75% without, or where they transport all but less than 1% of their patients without lights and siren, they start doing it more and more and looking for ways to use it less. And they feel like they arrive at a scene. They are not, ramped up with adrenaline and rush into the house. And then, they're all pumped up and now they have to, be that calm, caring person for the patient that's looking for somebody that's, a very competent, caring provider. It just sets a whole new thing. And when as we talk about burnout and that sort of thing, reducing the stress of the job is really important.
Great point. I love that extra point there. So much of this really is about our provider wellness. in addition to our community wellness. Great point. And thank you again, Dr. Kupas.
You're welcome.
Well, let's shift gears now and discuss a national quality improvement effort aimed at improving the safety of our responses and transports with Dr. Michael Redlenner. Dr. Redlenner is an associate professor in emergency medicine, the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in Manhattan, New York. He is the emergency department associate medical director there at Sinai and the medical director for their EMS quality improvement department. He is also the co-director of NEMSP's Quality and Safety course and the president of the National EMS Quality Alliance, or NEMSQA. All right. Well, Dr. Redlenner, thank you very much for joining us. I think what I'd like to do to start is ask, what is a performance measure guy like you doing in a quality improvement process like this? What is your involvement with this? We know what you do with NEMSQA, but how'd you get involved with quality improvement?
Well, Dr. Jarvis, it's a pleasure to be here today. And I think that you could probably attest to the fact that the group at NEMSQA, at the National EMS Quality Alliance, is very much involved with quality improvement in general. And this project with Red Lights and Sirens, or Lights and Sirens, is just a natural fit for us. And it really dovetails nicely with the work that we do at NEMSQA on a daily basis, on a weekly basis. And it puts into play the work that we've done, and it really makes it, it implements it on the ground level. And I think when at least from my perspective, when I think about this, that is where we want to be. That's where the National EMS Quality Alliance wants to be. We want to be at a place where we're creating effective quality measures that are useful and really give agencies and organizations the ability to put the evidence of this work into practice.
So I remember when we first started talking, when you were talking to me about serving on NEMSQA, and really the pitch you had is the Q in NEMSQA is really the whole reason we're doing this. It's to improve quality. And now we have this really specific, targeted improvement effort. Can you walk us a little through what the structure of this quality improvement effort is? Who's funding it, who's involved with it, and what it's who's actually getting the work done, if you will? Because there's always somebody behind the scenes making things happen.
Well, firstly, I would say that this is a huge collaborative effort with a number of partners from across the country. Mike Taigman is one of the great minds who's really pushed this project along, and Dr. Doug Kupas and the whole group, the expert panel that we've been working with, has helped us to shape this endeavor. We have at NEMSQA, Cherie Murphy is our executive director, and she has really been kind of the machine that makes this work. We have invested through our organization's funding in some of the products that we use for this project. So in some of the quality improvement software and some of the ways that we organize the data that's coming in from the project, we have invested in this. Otherwise, it's mostly a volunteer effort, honestly. We're hopeful that we'll find some funding at some point in order to, as people see the value of this, they'll want to come and fund some of these efforts at real improvement across the country.
I absolutely echo your shout out to Cherie. She does amazing work. I've been really impressed with the amount of excitement about this particular project, about reducing red light and siren use. But I'd like to get your thoughts about this, because when you're thinking about this initiative, you're not thinking necessarily just about red light and siren. Is that right?
So, no, that's a great point, Jeff. I would say that this EMS, it's a part of what we're envisioning as a larger effort to improve quality in a number of areas. And we hope that this serves as a model for something called the EMS Quality Improvement Project, which is, we hope that this is the first one where we take an initiative like this, we gather folks in a breakthrough collaborative model with the IHI that we've decided to use through this. Actually, Mike Taigman is our guru when it comes to the improvement science backbone of this project. But what we hope to do is really engage this idea with NEMSQA quality measures, essentially create a better practice environment.
So it's interesting because when I was interviewing Mike, I called him the guru of quality improvement too, and I'm not sure he knew what to do with that, which is ironic since I don't think either one of us are the first person to call him that. He's done amazing work. Well, speaking of that, when I got interested in quality improvement, Mike was one of the people I went to. You were one of the other people I went to. For our listeners and our viewers, if they were really interested in learning about quality improvement and wanted to maybe immerse themselves in an ongoing learning process, is there like a course that's available to them? How could they learn about this?
That's a great
How about
plug
low-hanging
there, Jeff.
pitches? Yeah.
So my involvement in quality goes back to when I started in EMS about a little more than a decade ago. And I became a new medical director at my organization. And I was asking the questions about, well, how do I know if we are doing a good job? How are we doing a good service? And I started looking around, and again, I gravitated towards quality measures and thinking about like, well, how am I going to measure how well we're doing in terms of the service, the medical service that we're providing for our patients? And I wouldn't say I couldn't find anything, but I couldn't find something that was established, that was evidence-based, that really was, portable into my environment without a lot of work and a lot of effort. And so I got interested in how do you think about measuring the quality that we want to see in the care that we provide to our patients. And so, I found National Association of EMS Physicians, which is a natural home for an EMS physician like myself. And on the quality committee, we started talking about, education and trying to get folks engaged in a better process to understand how they're doing quality, not just through chart review, but also, but thinking about how you look at the system. I started down this road of quality improvement, and we founded the National Association of EMS Physician Quality and Safety course. And it's a year-long course we use the Institute for Healthcare Improvement model for improvement. We nestled it really deeply within the EMS context. And so over the last 5 years, we've had EMS leaders and quality folks join this course, both kind of a local 2-day course model, and then also a year-long course where we've had now graduated 4 classes of folks who are now doing great improvement work. We're going to be doing a fellows course coming up in the spring. We're hoping to graduate folks who are interested in really changing the way we think about quality.
I can tell you it is really exciting to see the impact that course is having. I'm just seeing all of these disciples pop up throughout the profession, and they are really passionate about driving performance using the things they've learned, the improvement science. All right, so we've been building these disciples over the last 4 years. What is it about the environment now that made you think, right now, the iron is hot, let's get in and start doing some grassroots quality improvement?
So there's a confluence of factors that are making the time right for a national quality improvement like the Lights and Sirens project. One is that we have leaders, like we were discussing, that are coming out of these quality courses that are ready. Also, the access to electronic medical records and the electronic data in general allows us to look at large-scale data quickly and measure it over time quickly without doing a manual chart search. There obviously is the recent position statement on Lights and Sirens by the many national organizations that has put this at the forefront of our discussion. The science has been building for a long time. We know that use of Lights and Sirens is something that will save lives if we decide to use them effectively and appropriately, and in a limited fashion.
So I think that's a really great point. The idea that you can get 14 national organizations, all associated with EMS, to sign on to the same position and to push it is just absolutely amazing to me. I can't think of a time that's happened before. So, and the fact that it is happening around something that is so important, saving the lives and health of our providers, I think it's a really good thing. We've been talking in some generalities. We have this software platform, Simple QI. We have this initiative with opening up to 50 organizations to begin with, so we can work the kinks out and then move forward to a larger organization. What are some of the specific things we've been seeing, some of the specific changes that organizations have been doing to try to improve their performance on safe responses and safe transports?
It's a great question, Jeff. Well, I think what we are seeing is very exciting for anybody who is interested in how things change. There are 50 organizations with 50 different approaches. I would say one at the dispatch level. I go back to Doug Kupas and the group who think that lights and sirens is a medical intervention, right? And so you have to weigh the risks and the benefits of it. And that debate within the provider community is really strong, right? We are deeply ingrained to think that using lights and sirens is going to benefit our patients. And it may be true in a small percentage of folks, right, when we're responding to critical calls that require most rapid response. However, essentially, we know the science behind this, and that we can do non-lights and sirens transport with, safely and effectively. And but I think there's a lot of a psychological barrier with many of our providers who think that they're not doing the best that they can for their patients. And I think that this is something that we'll need to address specifically. This is a big topic of conversation among the agencies that are involved. The other thing that I would mention briefly is thinking about how do you integrate lights and sirens into medical protocols around response. And I think we're looking at that deeply. I think a number of organizations have touched on that. We are developing PDSAs, Plan, Do, Study, Act cycles to identify what specifically is going on in each organization and agency, and using those to identify how to overcome some of these common and understandable barriers.
Well, speaking of reducing lights and sirens, I heard some in the background there. Well, I heard the sirens, probably didn't hear the lights very much, but I'm guessing they were going. And since you're in New York City, and I've driven with lights and sirens in New York City before and realized that it's mostly a futile gesture, I'm guessing people weren't getting out of the way.
Yeah, that's a big problem right here.
Kind of hard to get out of the way when there's nowhere to go.
Yeah.
Well, so one of the things that I saw, you talked about attitudes, about providers and their concern that they're not doing the best for their patients. The MedStar system actually uploaded a list of surveys that they're doing, surveys of the public, surveys of providers. And we looked at that and we just adopted that. We changed some of the verbiage and we sent those out to gauge the opinions and attitudes of our folks so that we can then target our educational efforts to those attitudes. I think that's really, really important.
Jeff, I think that is one of the key points that a quality improvement project like this does. It takes lessons learned from one organization or agency, and it allows them to be applied very specifically to another organization. Again, like you said, with just a subtle difference. One thing I would say also, just a point that you had mentioned earlier, that there's 50 organizations that are involved with this right now. We've had a lot of internal discussions around making the learning available to any organization that wants to be a part of this. This is not an exclusive project. This is a way to start small and grow bigger. Some agencies I've heard feel a bit left out of this, but the reality is that's not the point.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You mentioned the United States and Canada because we have some colleagues from Canada who are doing great work in this area. But you're right, we don't want it to be exclusionary, and the lessons that we learn are just as applicable to the systems in London or Rio de Janeiro or Tokyo as they are in New York City or Austin, Texas. So, and we want to make that learning available to everybody. So, Michael, what is the goal of this initiative? We're all about measurement, right? So let's put some numbers on it. What's the goal?
Well, Jeff, let me start by saying the more general idea. So really what we're trying to accomplish is to increase the percent of safe transports without the use of lights and sirens. And so when we think about it, and it's really a funny story. We've talked a lot about this in the improvement project group with not just a little bit of disagreement, but I'll turn it over to you to kind of describe the rationale for it.
Yeah, sure. So the disagreement here is we have two measures, Safety 01, which is the proportion of 911 responses without lights and sirens, and Safety 02, which is the same one for transports. Why are we doing these as what are essentially inverse measures? Why are we measuring the lack of lights and sirens? Well, and the reason is because all of our measures, not just the safety measures, but all of the measures throughout NEMSQA are designed where higher performance is better. We're trying to encourage the behavior that we want to see. So we carried that across to the two safety measures. These safety measures were in place long before the QI initiative came around. So what we're looking for, what we want to see, is safer responses to the scene, safer transports to the hospital. And what we know from the science is not using lights and sirens increases safety. So that's the reason they're set up the way we are.
I couldn't say it better, Jeff. So for the
almost like I've had some experience explaining this.
Yes, good. I unfortunately we have to explain a little bit, but I do think that there is some, like you described, a rationale to doing it. So for the National Quality Project, we are looking for 70% of responses to the scene to be without the use of lights and sirens. And we're looking for 90% of transports to the hospital to be done without lights and sirens. And so we think that these numbers take into account some of the variability, some of the concerns about the rapid response using lights and sirens that is held among the EMS community. And we think that that's a reasonable number for organizations to aim for.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I know that we will get a lot of pushback, perhaps from some higher performing agencies that say, why are you setting the bar so low? And I said, well, my thought on this is, that old adage, don't let perfection be the enemy of better. And yes, I think we would all love to see 85% of responses, 100% of transports, or 98% of transports. But what we want is better. And we'll accept better over perfection any day, because perfection is not likely to happen. The other thing I think is really important for us to understand is we are talking about reduction of lights and siren, not elimination, because we recognize that, like any medical intervention, sometimes there are places where it's warranted. Cardiac arrest jumps to mind for our responses. I think it's important that we say we're not trying to take your lights and sirens away. We're just trying to help you use them better. Dr. Redlenner, thank you so much. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you, Dr. Jarvis. It's a pleasure as always, and your partnership at NEMSQA has been invaluable. So we look forward to continuing those efforts.
All right, great information from Dr. Redlenner. Let's now finish up with an interview from Mike Taigman. Mike is one of the leading experts in EMS quality improvement. He is the improvement guide at First Watch. And improvement guide, what does that mean? That is a title so uniquely humble that I know he had to have been the one who came up with it. I can hear him saying to Todd Stout now, no, improvement guide. I like that. We'll do that. Mike started his career in EMS with Denver paramedics many, many moons ago. In addition to leading EMS agencies across the country, helping numerous other agencies as a consultant, lecturing nationally, authoring over 600 different articles, Mike has been one of my personal mentors and role models since my days as an EMT and a paramedic student back in the mid-1980s. Getting to know him as a friend, teaching with him, and working with him on several different projects, including EMS 2050, it's been one of the highlights of my career. Let's hear his thoughts on using the science of improvement to make our jobs safer. Mike Taigman, thank you so much for joining us on this really exciting podcast.
I am thrilled to be invited to sit with the cool kids.
Mike, I have to tell you, when I think about quality improvement, I think I want to go find the Yoda. I want to find the QI guru. And I can't think of anybody that better describes than you. So I am so thrilled to have you on this pod.
Well, I'm not sure I can live up to that. I do know some gurus that I can introduce you to, but I'll do my best to impersonate one for you. How's that?
I love it. I know you're going to do great. Let's start off. I want to know, what is it that got you interested in improving responses to scenes and transports? How did you get interested in making this safer?
When you ask that question, the first thing that pops to mind is the first ambulance crash I was involved in, and I'm embarrassed to say that I was the one driving. I was working for the city and county of Denver, and we had been at Denver General Hospital, and actually I was a brand new medic, and I had just been released from the driver training program about 40 minutes before this particular crash, which is horrible. We had gotten dispatched to an unknown injury in the northern part of Denver, and the street I was responding down at Spear Avenue, and it's 3 lanes of traffic each direction with a big center divide, and it was crossing over Colfax Avenue, which is another 3 lanes of traffic plus a turn lane. So 4 lanes I was crossing over at a diagonal, and I had my lights and siren on. I was in the inside lane, and as I was going through the intersection, a big semi trailer pulled partially into the intersection and stopped. I was advancing. I was going pretty slow, but I looked up to the right. I had a red light I was going through. Looked up to the right and saw traffic stopping. Looked to the left, and the inside lanes here were stopping. Looked back up to the right just as I was passing right in front of the semi trailer, and I caught a Dodge Power Wagon in the left front door of my ambulance. It was doing 45 miles an hour. Nailed us pretty hard. The other thing I forgot to mention is that the main fire station for the city and county of Denver, where the chief and everybody is at the intersection of Spear and Colfax there in Denver. As we get nailed and driven and spun around in the intersection, the chief of the department, everybody's emptying out of the fire station. Fortunately, nobody was injured in this particular crash. Got moved to the back of a patrol car to start my paperwork. All 4 television news channels showed up, both newspapers for the city and county of Denver being photographed. My chief paramedic, Bob Marlin at the time, comes and opens the back of the patrol car and says, "Are you hurt?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Finish your paperwork." I also forgot to mention, this was a brand new ambulance. It had 1,300 miles on it, and I had just totaled it, and it was hands down my fault, and something that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been running red lights and siren. And the other ambulance that was dispatched to the call, it turned out to have been a sprained ankle, was the unknown nature of the injury that was associated with this destruction. So, thinking about that, and then I unfortunately have not been involved in other significant ambulance crashes, but I've kind of lost count of the number of wake crashes of other vehicles that happened behind me after I'd gone through intersections or whatever it had happened to be. So it just, kind of early on kind of planted the seed for me of, is this really a safe practice, and what benefit are we creating here? So that was kind of what planted the seed for me a long time ago.
Mike, as you were telling this story, I'm like, he sure does remember an awful lot of details. I wonder why this left such an impression. And hell, you don't have to remember the details. It was documented for you.
Absolutely documented with above the fold full color photographs on the front page of both the Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post, and in the first 3 minutes of the news on all 4 of the news channels in town.
That's what I like about you, Mike. When you do something, you are all in.
it was big and embarrassing, and I am so grateful that that nobody got hurt.
Absolutely. It's a scary collision. I'm glad we can joke about it after the fact, because we got lucky through no actions of anybody's. We just got lucky.
Exactly.
I'm glad to hear y'all are all right. Well, Mike, we have been talking about this quality improvement effort, something called EQIP. And as we were going through, I was kind of thinking about this, the EMS Quality Improvement Partnership. Now, that's a very catchy acronym. I like catchy acronyms as much as the next guy, but we're talking about red lights and sirens, as I say, or lights and siren, as Dr. Kupas says. I don't see that in the acronym anywhere. So tell me, why is it EQIP and there's no red light and siren in there?
You know, I've been involved in performance improvement in EMS since the late 1980s. So, you know, well over 34, 35 years at this point in time. And this is the first time in my career where we've got a bunch of people who've really been well trained in improvement science in EMS. The National Association of EMS Physicians has been running their quality and safety course, which we're both faculty of. So there's a bunch of people in our industry who've been well trained in improvement science. NEMSQA has a set of performance measures that are actually uncontroversial and widely agreed upon, which unlike previous efforts, there's nobody shooting torpedoes or howitzers at this list. So it was like, you know, maybe it's time for us to take a crack at a large scale, widespread performance improvement project that other areas of healthcare have kind of tackled these kinds of things, but EMS never really has on a large scale, working together across systems, across organizations, across the country on a similar project. So it seemed like it was time for us to tackle something. And looking at the 13 NEMSQA measures, the measures that probably had the biggest gap between what's performance across the U.S. and most systems, and where we could be. So, you know, when you're looking to make improvements, it's nice to have a gap between where you are and where you could be. And many of the other measures were probably much closer on where we'd like to be and where we actually are. So picking the lights and siren topic as kind of a place to start. But in doing this, we kind of hope to build a framework, an infrastructure, if you will, to be able to tackle other improvement projects in the future. So starting with lights and siren, there's a big gap. There's a lot of room for meaningful improvement. The theory is that if you kind of seed our industry with a win of being able to make significant improvement by working collaboratively using improvement science, provides people with the energy and the optimism to tackle things maybe like cardiac arrest resuscitation.
Well, I'll tell you what, man, you know me, I'm a nerd. I know you, you're a nerd. Let's get nerdy and talk about what we do with all this data. So part of this partnership is we collect data and we share data. And we're looking at two measures here: the safe response to the scene without lights and sirens, and the safe transport to the hospital without lights and sirens. So I have this data, and it looks like over time, my numbers have improved. How do I know whether that's an actual improvement or whether it's just random noise and I just got lucky?
So thank you for the invitation to nerd out on a little bit of statistics. And for those of you listening who have been exposed to research statistics over the years, where you're looking at p-values and student t-tests and those kinds of things, improvement science uses more probability statistics. So you look at your performance over time, and we plot the dots, if you will, on your, in this case for our project, weekly performance on the percentage of 911 responses that are dispatched not using lights and siren, and the percentage of 911 patients who are transported to the hospital without using lights and siren. And you do that weekly percentage. You plot the dots on initially what's called a run chart. Once you get enough data points, you can add some control limits to it and make it a control chart. But there are a set of specific probability statistical tests that allow you to separate what's called common cause variation, which is that variation that's just inherent in any process. And the blood pressure that you had when you woke up this morning is probably not exactly the same as the blood pressure you have right in this moment. And throughout the course of your day, it varies up and down. If your spleen ruptures or you take a big hit of crystal meth, they may cause your blood pressure to go way up or way down based on something that is outside of your normal process, and that would be called special cause variation. So in improvement, we're looking to create a special cause of improvement. And there's a set of criteria where you're looking at the charts that allow you to determine that something has changed in a meaningful and effective way. So the change we're hoping to cause around lights and siren would be referred to as a run, where you get 6 or more dots on a run chart, 8 or more dots on a control chart that are consecutive above the center line or the mean of the data that shows that you've made a meaningful improvement.
What I hear you saying, fellow nerd, is that it's not a gestalt. You can look at something and say, well, that number is bigger than this number. That must be real. And that's not enough. There are some actually validated rules that you can apply to these charts to see whether you've made improvement or not.
The statistics were done by Walter Schuhart originally at Bell Labs, and then really propagated by W. Edwards Deming, and have been validated and enhanced by all kinds of organizations. The ones that have been my biggest teachers are actually based in your neck of the woods, the associates in performance improvement based out of Austin, Texas, who were basically Deming's road crew for years and built the improvement science framework that's used by the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, which is kind of the knowledge holders and base for all the work we're doing here.
Good Texan work there. I
Absolutely.
like it. So Mike, you mentioned Deming, and I think a lot of us, probably more people who have heard of Deming than Schuhart, even though you don't really talk about the Deming charts. So, he may not get the billing he deserves. But the thing a lot of us associate with him is, and he may not have been the one who said this, but talks about the performance of something that, a system is designed to give. Can you actually refresh my memory here? What is that quote?
And of course, I just forgot it. So
nothing like setting you up to fail.
That's right. So systems are perfectly designed to get the results they produce.
Interesting.
And which is a suggestion that the system design and the process design has a much bigger influence on results than individuals do in the system. So often in old school EMS quality related work, quality assurance, quality improvement, the mental model is if we can just improve the individual EMTs and paramedics that work in the system, everything will be good. And what we have found over time is that doing individual coaching and education and feedback rarely produces significant improvement, that you need to change your protocols, your processes, your systems, your equipment, your framework on a larger scale in order to get large scale improvement.
Getting back to the nerdy stuff, talking about those specific rules and tests, that's a lot of information that doesn't come naturally to us. It certainly wasn't included in medical school. It wasn't included in paramedic school, at least when I went to paramedic school. If you have someone in an EMS system that wants to improve performance with lights and sirens or improve performance on anything, where do they go to learn how to do these things?
It's a superb question. One of the best sources in our industry is the National Association of EMS Physicians. We've got a quality and safety course that is basically it starts with a 2-day session, usually at the national conference. Some of those 2-day sessions have been offered virtually. We're actually going to be doing one specifically for EMS fellows. Another option for a more self-directed learning, the Institute for Healthcare Improvement has what they call their Open School, which is a series of online education programs, many of them provided by Dr. Dave Williams, who is another Austin, Texas person. Austin, Texas seems to be the hotbed of wisdom and knowledge around improvement science in our world and in a lot of healthcare. That's a great way to learn. Another program that you can actually access for free through Harvard X. It's Practical Improvement Science in Healthcare. But those are some fabulous and economical ways to learn about this. If you really want to geek out on it, there's the Improvement Advisor course offered through the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. It's like getting a master's degree in improvement science. And I'll put a pitch in for the graduate program I teach in, a master's in healthcare administration and interprofessional leadership at the University of California, San Francisco. It is mostly an online program. There are a couple of 1 or 2 day long residential components to the year-long program, but it is improvement science anchored master's program in healthcare administration and interprofessional leadership. And we just had our very first EMS person, Jake Shores, a paramedic from up in Portland, Oregon, just graduated with his Master of Science from UCSF through our program.
Outstanding. You know, one of the benefits of doing this as a video and as a podcast, the videos, we can just slap the links up on the screen. So feel free to click on those links to get to these resources. On the podcast, we'll include them in the show notes. You know, when I said that you were the guru of quality improvement, and I knew that when I wanted to talk to somebody about this, you were the person to come to. Now I think everybody knows exactly why I felt that way. Great information, Mike. And as always, it is a wonder. It is a joy talking to you. It was wonderful, man. Thank you so much for your time. It's great talking to you.
And thank you for including me. I always enjoy hanging out with you in any fashion, any way I possibly can, Jeff.
This is a lot of fun. Thanks a lot, man.
Absolutely. Thank you.
This has been such a great episode with so much great material from so many amazing EMS leaders. I'd like to close with a quick summary of what I view as the case against lights and sirens that we have heard so far in these interviews. Number one, lights and sirens saves on average between 3 and 4 minutes for both responses and transport. 2, lights and siren use is associated with increased collisions and increased injuries. And 3, the time saved using lights and sirens rarely improves clinical outcomes. And finally, number 4, we should consider lights and sirens to be a clinical intervention, and like any other intervention, only use them when the benefits outweigh the risks. I hope you will all join us in improving the safety of our responses and transports by using lights and sirens judiciously and in a thoughtful manner. And finally, please, please, please wear your seatbelts, both in the front, but especially in the back of the unit. Guys, in the words of Sergeant Phil Esterhaus of Hill Street Blues, let's be careful out there. Take care, y'all.
You've been listening to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, a proud member of the FlightBridge Ed podcast family and a Fire Dog production. Visit flightbridgeed.com for more information.